Come on up, guys. All right, let's see if we can emulate the senator's example and keep this stuff as comprehensible and kind of, useful as he just was. That'd be pretty terrific. We've got an outstanding panel for the third panel in the day. We want to talk a little bit about the reality of school choice, how it works, what are some of the obstacles, how do the numbers work. Sitting immediately next to me, we've got Ann Duplessis. Ann's former senator, state senator in Louisiana. She's president of Louisiana Federation for Children, where she partners with local and national policy leaders to promote educational options. She continues to work full-time while she does this as senior vice president for Liberty Bank and Trust in New Orleans. Oh, she's also the chair of Louisiana State Board of Supervisors. Following Hurricane Katrina, it was Ann who authored a bill which allowed the state to take over the majority of schools in Orleans Parish, which led to the thriving charter school movement that you see in New Orleans today. So next to Ann is Kevin Chavous. Kevin's a founding board member and executive counsel for the American Federation for Children and the Alliance for School Choice, a noted author and a national education reform leader. He helped to shepherd the charter school movement into the nation's capital, is chair of the D.C. City Council's Education Committee, creating the most prolific charter school jurisdiction in the country. Next up, we have Emily Kim. Emily is the Chief Policy and Legal Officer at Success Academy Charter Schools, which operates 32 public charter schools in New York City. She also heads a litigation team that has led the way in the defense of the charter school movement in New York. Before joining Success Academy, she practiced litigation in New York City and taught high school English. And finally, back with us, you'll recognize him from the second panel, is Bob Enlow, good friend and president of the Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice. Kevin, you've been doing this stuff in D.C. a long time. Let me start with you. As you all were pushing to give kids the opportunity to attend charters in D.C., wondering if there's one or two moments where the politics were especially tough or where you were especially nervous about how this would work, and how you guys addressed that?
Well, thank you, Rick, and it's good to be here, and I want to thank Senator Scott. Let's give him another hand for putting this together. I'm just so impressed with him and his commitment to kids, and the fact that young people are able to ask questions and engage in this process is really important. So when we started the charter movement back in the late 90s here in D.C., that's when I learned firsthand the politics of education, which I think is the biggest barrier to our children learning, where I heard some of these great ideas for some innovative and creative schools, like the folks from the Seed School came to me and said they wanted to start a residential school where kids could go and live, and some came from homes that didn't serve them well. And I said, that's a great idea. And then some of the people who were part of the status quo said, no, that's a bad idea because we're not controlling it. And then folks came to me, talk about Hospitality High School, a math and science school. Cesar Chavous, some of those folks are here. Donald Hentz came. All these folks came with these innovative ideas. And my thinking was, why don't we give these new and innovative and creative ideas a chance to succeed? But the politics of education has been the biggest barrier to what works for kids. So I adopted a simple strategy, Rick, and that is, will this help a child learn? If the answer is yes, I'm for it. If the answer is no, I'm against it. And I think that that is the yardstick, frankly, in which we should discharge our responsibilities as adults, either as public officials or advocates or parents or policymakers. We should embrace any and all things that will help a child learn. And the politics of education, I think, has been a big barrier. One other thing that's been a big barrier, which I think is equally as troubling as the politics, and that is the fact when you hear all this talk about, even debates on standards, debates on early childhood education, debates on all these policy thrusts, they're not grounded in the practical reality of parents today. When I had a debate with Randy Weingarten, I asked her one question. I said, Randy, what do you say to the low-income parent making less than $30,000 a year in Harlem or the Bronx or Southeast DC or Crenshaw, LA, pick a city, whose the parent knows that their child is going to enter a middle school or high school next year where 85 or 90% of the kids are failing? What do you say to that parent who is waking up every day knowing that they have limited options because of zip code, they have to send their kid to a certain kid? What do you say to that parent who wants something different? The problem with our approach to education policy and discharging that responsibility that we have to these kids is there's no sense of urgency with respect to the needs of that parent. It's all like numbers on a page. But all of these stories, all of these individual stories, these individual challenges, the individual frustrations of these parents, they matter. And for us to act like that it's okay for us to plan the plan and study the study and the debate to debate, that doesn't work for parents on a practical basis. So one thing that I think we should do, and the reason why educational choice is so important, is it gives us an opportunity to meet parents where they are today, deal with the sense of urgency, the urgency of needs that parents have today, as opposed to waiting for the system to right-size itself for everyone to get it whenever that is supposed to happen. So I think the big obstacles I see are the politics of education and the fact that everything we do in terms of talking about education and learning is with the long-range plan, and there's really nothing that deals with the immediacy of these parents' needs, and that's what we get through educational choice.
Ann, as you work on these issues in Louisiana, some folks probably try to offer Kevin's argument in the opposite form, saying, look, this school choice stuff might have some possibilities downstream, but right now you're taking dollars away from schools that are struggling with kids. How do you justify that, and how do you make those numbers work?
Well, thank you. And I'd also like to thank, I'd also like to thank Senator Scott for putting this forum on. It truly is very important, and it's very important for us to hear not only the issues, but also some solutions. And so, you know, it was really funny when I became an elected official. I didn't think that it was my job or my position to deal with the public school system and the things that were going on at the local level. I was a lawmaker. I was, you know, a state senator, and that was for the local government to deal with. It became evident to me rather quickly when my constituency told me loud and clear they didn't care if I was a state senator or the local, garbage collector. I was elected, and I was elected to help them with a problem. And so when I looked at the issues and that our public school system was facing, and then the challenges of us us taking money from the public school system, I realized very fast that it didn't matter that we were funding a bad thing. I tried to help folk understand that, you know, throwing money after something that was hurting our kids and hurting our quality of life, and I can talk about what this means as a quality of life issue, was not a good thing. So I didn't care about a system. I didn't care about funding something that wasn't working. What I cared about was using the dollars that we had in a more efficient and more effective manner.
Okay, Bob, as we think about efficient and effective schools where they're doing the most good for kids with the dollars they have, do we know much about how traditional district schools compare to charter schools, compare to private schools?
Yeah, I think we know a lot. I'd like to add my comments as well to say thank you to Senator Scott. But we know a lot about traditional public schools, or what I would call state-run schools. We publicly fund schools through taxation, but they're run by the state or by the local entities. They're ostensibly the same thing you'd have if you'd run a grocery shop with state-run entities. What do we know when that happens? we know that the costs are extremely high. So remember, the revenue sources for traditional public schools comes from 3 areas: local dollars through taxation, state dollars, and federal dollars. All in, that's about, depending on the state, somewhere an average of $13,000 to $14,000 a year. In some states, like New Jersey, and some cities like District of Columbia, or some areas like District of Columbia, that's up in the $20,000 range for traditional public schools, right? So this is because there's a bureaucracy that has been built up around supporting a system, not students, right? So the system has been made for the adults. The money has to flow that way. What school choice and charter schools have done, and what private schools, let me reflect on that for a second. What the ability of parents to choose a charter school or a private school using the public money set aside for them has done, has started to see that what does it cost to educate children. Charter schools are typically doing it for 80% or less. Private school and the voucher programs are doing it for much less than that. So in my home state of Indiana, an elementary school student who's receiving a voucher, who's poor, gets $4,800 to go to a private school. He can get $15,000 if he goes to a failing public school, or sorry, state-run school. So what we do know from we know that the current system is inefficient. We also know from choice programs, the Friedman Foundation just did a study. We looked at the 10 voucher programs that have been enacted since 1996 to 2010. $1.7 billion in savings to the states. The sad thing is we can't tell you where that money went. We know that the states have saved that money through school choice programs because it costs less to educate a child in a traditional private school or a charter school.
So, and Bob, just to clarify on this, so when you suggest that it costs $13,000, $14,000 to educate a kid in a traditional district school, 80% of that on average in a charter, and maybe less than that in a private school. Why is that? Like, where do these savings come from? Why is it cheaper in some schools than others?
Well, some of it's because they've been charging tuition, they subsidize it. In the private sector, you have multiple ways to bring revenue in, right? So if you're, let's say you're a voucher receiving private school in the District of Columbia, or at least in Indiana. You get the voucher. You can get parents who can top up if they're able to. You can get a scholarship tax credit added on that. You can get the schools themselves and their fundraising to help. You have multiple sources of revenue, which allows for a better price controls.
So does that mean they're not actually running cheaper, but it's cheaper to the families?
Cheaper to the families.
But so they cost the same to operate?
No, because we don't have this. The private schools and charter schools tend to not have the same debt and the same amount of bureaucracy. You know, in economic terms, to be one of those suit pants again, it's called the monopolist rent, right? When you're providing a lower quality product for a higher cost, someone's taking a cut where the market is supposed to draw a line, sort of supply and demand, basic economics, right? So this is what every student will know. So it costs you this for this to get this many. And that's what public schools have traditionally done, that they've charged more for a product that's not as good.
Emily, so Success Academies is a growing organization of charter schools in New York City. You guys have got real high performance. Could you talk a little bit both about how much does it cost to run Success Academy schools compared to other New York schools, and what are some of the challenges of trying to grow and add new school sites and create more seats for kids?
Sure. Thank you, Rick. I'd like to add my thanks to Senator Scott and his staff for this extraordinary day as well. So Success Academy Charter Schools has about 32 schools in New York City, nearly 9,500 scholars, as we refer to them. The student population is about 95% minority and 80% free and reduced price lunch. And our scholars are in the top 1% in the entire state of New York in math and top 3% in English language arts. We're very proud of the accomplishments of our scholars. You know, just to add to what Rob said, there is a tremendous funding disparity between what public charter school students receive and district school students. In New York, it's about $6,000 between what DOE spends and what charters are receiving. And to add to the disparity, we have a longer school year, a longer school day, and by the time our scholars will have graduated from high school, we will have offered about 4 years of additional education as compared to their traditional district counterparts. So there is a profound disparity, and what we're doing differently is we're leaner on the bureaucracy, as Rob mentioned. Now, I will say that bureaucracy is, as we get bigger, is one of those dangerous things that, just as the charter community in general, we have to be very cautious that we're not allowing bureaucracy to overtake what it is that we're doing. And it's harder as we grow. Just counting up, before I got here, I had my team count up the reports that our schools were required to prepare over the course of a year. It's something like 60 major reports that request demands for reporting that we get. 25 of which from various sources, city, state, federal, that require hundreds and hundreds of hours of personnel time, thousands and thousands of pieces of paper, and that we would argue, first of all, I don't think anybody's really looking at, and more importantly, it's not relevant to whether our schools are doing well. We think that the authorizer should be the one that is holding charters accountable, and they should be holding them accountable at a very, very high level. And if charters are not performing, they should be closed. But with respect to the many reporting requirements and the bureaucracy, we call it bureaucracy creep, that is slowly entering into what charters do, it is literally crippling, I think, the charter school movement. And I've said this before, but I believe that bureaucracy creep could actually take the charter movement down. And if I may add a little bit tangentially, I do think our opponents and the teachers union is very much aware of that. And what we find is in the attacks that we're getting, it's along the lines of bureaucracy. Just as a quick little example, last year there was sort of an arcane real estate law, I won't get too much into it, that we heard was sort of passing through the legislature more quickly than usual. And we could have it could have passed unnoticed, but what it was a new procedure that you would have to, charters would now have to undergo through real estate law in order to get your facilities. And fortunately, folks noticed this, and there was a little bit of an outcry. But what it was doing was adding tremendous layers of bureaucracy in order to try to stop us in our tracks. So I think bureaucracy is definitely a danger for charters.
So let's stay with that. Ann, this is something obviously that you all have to wrestle with, because when people like bureaucracy, they say it's quality control. They say it's a way to make sure that children aren't being done wrong. But how do we make sure that doesn't get in the way of educators being able to work with kids and make good decisions?
Right. I think, you know, one thing we are very much in favor of, and that's accountability. Because that's what this is all about. How are we accountable to the quality outcomes that we're seeking? And so, you know, what we have to do, though, is to ensure that the measures and the policies that we put in place, as we've all talked about, aren't a hindrance to that school's ability to be unique. And so that's what we like, or what I love about the charter school environment in Louisiana, is that our schools are allowed to be unique as it relates to operations and the methods by which they're educating our kids. You know, one of the things that I wanted to piggyback on Rob's comment about the cost savings, if I may, we found, you know, with regard to our thriving voucher school voucher movement, as well as the movement towards tax rebates, we're finding that in our state, last year actually we saved over $24 million of taxpayer dollars in the monies that would be originally provided to a failing school for a child that were given to a voucher school to help educate.
And when you say the $24 million was saved, can you just say another word of explaining how it's saved?
Absolutely. So in Louisiana, the kids are funded through the minimum foundation formula, which creates an amount that is allocated per child. In Louisiana, it's about $8,600. And so that $8,600 traditionally would have gone to a failing public school or a public school. In retrospect, if that child had a voucher, the average tuition at a private school or Catholic school that is participating in our program is about $5,000, $4,500 to $5,000. So when you look at the difference of over $4,000 per child, that's a huge, tremendous amount of savings to the taxpayers.
Emily, let me ask you to just clarify a bit. When you talk about this bureaucratic creep, can you give a couple examples to folks who maybe don't do this stuff every day of what does it look like, and so where are these hundreds of hours going that aren't being spent working with kids?
Sure, and Rick, I think you make a very good point. Every hour spent on reporting, those are hours that are not spent on kids. And since I see many charter school students here and staff, I think you would agree with me that charters are staffing more leanly, and so we don't have the additional staff to spare to dedicate to these hundreds and hundreds of hours projects. Our local district asked us to have one person at each of our schools to operate the ATS system, which is this computer system that all public schools in New York City have to operate. And it's this DOS-based system with the green blinking thing. From my understanding, you have to log in 5 different ways before you can get to the start screen. And then you have to enter screen by screen the information. If you make a mistake and have to go back, you may be 30 out of 500 students in, you have to then start all over. So, and the reason why I say from my understanding is to the best that we've been able to, we have to now been able to resist using this ATS. I think it's called Automate the Schools, which is a little bit ironic to us. But they wanted us to staff our schools to do nothing but enter student by student our attendance data and things of this nature, which we can't do. Every single person in that school, for those of you who are educators, know every single person is striving to have each child perform at the highest possible level. So that is the kind of thing that we're faced with. The other thing I would add is amongst the reporting, it's incredibly duplicative. And it would be okay if we could say, let's take this report from our authorizer and the state wants it too. Here, let's pass this over to the state and you can share. First of all, they don't share and they don't talk to each other. But other challenges that we face, they all have spent tremendous amounts of money in creating their own computer systems, and it has to be entered in their own format. Has to be entered in their own format, meaning you can't take the data that you've produced elsewhere and share across the board. You've got to enter student by student. And we have developed sort of what we call a bureaucracy busting arm in our organization, where that is just as important to us to fight the bureaucracy creep as, not quite as important as the education, but it's part and parcel of high-performing schools.
Kevin, I mean, this sounds disconcerting to me because it seems like part of the whole rationale of charters was so educators could focus on working with students and not filling out paper. How common is this? How much of a concern is this for you?
Well, you know, I was just whispering to Ann that it reminds me of that old expression, I've used this before, that we look in the mirror and we become the very thing that we've been fighting. And that happens. There's this natural tendency to over-bureaucratize things. Look, at the end of the day, I think that we have to go back to the basics and remind ourselves why we got in this movement. I'm somewhat concerned about the fact that we do imitate and replicate the monopoly that we tend to fight by, you know, putting in rules and regulations that are unnecessary, putting in barriers for parents who want to engage in choice. And look, the bottom line is, as Steve Perry said earlier, and wasn't Steve Perry great? I mean, he just is terrific. And this is not a jobs program. This is about education and learning. We have doubled education spending in this country over the last 30 years. In some states, we've tripled it. And you know this, Rick. And yet the outputs are going down. We now, even when we have so-called the autonomous school model working in a lot of school districts, we have principals who still have to have 4 or 5 people from central office check the box if they want to rent out their gym, okay? So, you know, there's this tendency for us to over-bureaucratize all aspects of education. And I think that the way we have to do it is have a little pivot, a shift in our approach. When I was in Texas a couple weeks ago, they asked me, well, how will school choice affect the local district? And if you think about the tone and tenor of most of these questions we get, always say, well, how will it affect the system or the local school district? But the pivot is, how will this affect the kids if we don't change? See, we need to start looking at how we staff schools, how we fund schools, how we engage in this whole notion of education and learning, not from the vantage point of the local school district or the system, but the kids. And so this is the way I would look at it. And I know Eva subscribes to this at Harlem Success. You know, and Howard Fuller has this great example. You know, if you're going to fund a school system or a school district, you start with the most important thing. Let's imagine you have a child. Call that child a student. You put them in a room. Call it a classroom. And you have an adult who's going to teach them. Call that a teacher. And then you put some other children in there. And everything you do should be tailored toward funding that interaction between those students and that teacher so that child can learn. But what we do with the school bureaucracy in a district, where only 60% of the dollars in some states, 50% in some states go into the classroom, is we spend it on everything else. And I remember when I used to have those city council hearings and the superintendent would bring 50 people with them and say, we need this because it's the assistant to the deputy assistant of the assistant. And it's important, it's essential personnel, and we can't do without it. Well, if you ratchet it down to that dynamic that's most important, the children and the teacher in the classroom, there's no way, if you have a school district, this is the first thing any superintendent should do, where you have less than 90% of the dollars going into the classroom, then you're not funding education, teaching, and learning. You're funding a bureaucracy. So I think that's part of the way to get rid of bureaucracy creep, or this notion that we end up, you know, replicating the thing we're fighting, is to make sure that we keep tabs on how we're funding those extraneous jobs and services that really don't have anything to do with that main dynamic of teaching and learning in the classroom. And I think that's a discipline that politically is hard because folks would have to change the way they do business.
Kevin, I mean, you're absolutely right when you talk about, you know, changing the way we do business. But unfortunately, where we are today this is big business. The education is big business. We are fighting money. We are fighting tradition. We are fighting people's jobs. And so until and unless we can get past the issues that this is some tradition that we must maintain, until we can have people understand that we need to create new traditions, until we can get past that the jobs that we're talking about are not jobs that we need to protect if those jobs aren't protecting our kids. We have to get past that, and unless we can get our elected officials to understand that, this will all be continue to be more of a challenge.
But this is why, I totally agree with it, and this is why school choice and particularly vouchers are so important. In every single state, more than at least half, if not more, than every single dollar goes to K-12 education in your state. It's a huge business.
Yes, it is.
Right? And we're talking about fighting the power of that business. And the problem is you create this symbiotic relationship, or this relationship where legislators and public policy, school groups come together, because who's the largest employer in the rural and suburban areas in most areas? The schools.
That's right.
They have the power, and so they have the legislative power. Therefore, they have the PAC and the money that goes to candidates. And there's this incredible relationship between half your state budget and the same people benefiting. It's this sort of, we would call that in other states and other areas maybe corruption, right? If you think about it. So this is the reason why all the dollars have to follow the kids,
Yes.
right? Why you have to have vouchers, because until you allow and empower the consumers with total choice, you're never going to change the structure of the monopoly that has so much money. My favorite example on the regulatory creep thing is, who here knows what Chief Seattle's letter is? Anyone? Well, our voucher program in Indiana, the private schools are required to have a hard copy of that letter. You know, this is the 21st century, so hard copies are required, and they can get kicked out of the program if they don't have a hard copy. That's the kind of regulatory environment you can get in, because remember, this is a system that has built itself up over a long period of time, and it's not just the legislators, it's not just the public school bureaucrats, it's every single committee. It's every single school committee. It's every single level of this government.
So Bob, but just to stay with this, so then are you suggesting that this regulatory creep concern that Emily flagged is not just exists for charter schools, but also for private choice programs?
Yeah, there's an absolute move in this country from people who oppose school choice to make all the charter schools and all the private schools that are receiving public money just like public schools. And by the way, I think we as reformers also are a little bit to blame for this. Because we'll accept anything sometimes to get a bill passed, right? Instead of saying this is a line in the sand. And when we say accountability, we mean accountability for results. So in our state of Indiana, when you fail, when you're rated D or F as a private school that receives vouchers after 2 years, you can get no more new money for new kids, right? The way to change that for us, our accountability was starve the money out. But, right, so, but we've accepted a bunch of other things like Chief Seattle's letter, right? And then reporting all that kind of stuff. It's the inanity of the reporting because it's okay to report even though if private schools don't have the personnel to do it.
Okay, Emily, I want to go to you one sec, but Bob, while we're on this, we've got an audience question from Wayne Knode at Grace Christian Academy in Waldorf. Wayne, are you here with us? There we go. And Wayne asked, how can private schools better demonstrate to the public sector, especially the business sector, the important role that they play? How can private schools demonstrate the important role that they play?
I mean, there's a ton of ways they can do that. Obviously, showing their graduation rates, but to me, I look at I have 2 children, right? And they're 18 and soon to be 16 in about a week. And I love them to death, but I really only care about one thing. Are they going to become tax-paying citizens? Right? Are they going to become people who have a job and pay taxes? And so one of the best ways private schools can figure that out, show their value, is to show how much money they bring back into the system as a result of their education.
So Emily, you were talking before about this emphasis on bureaucracy busting in order to really let the educators focus on educating. What are some of the things that you guys have done or that folks can learn from y'all about how to make that happen?
So I think one of the things that we do, actually, Kevin, I can tell you've spoken a lot with Eva, as you say, because one of our mantra, and for folks who come into our organization, the first thing that we ask is it good for children? And sort of rules be darned, is it good for children? And if it's not, if it's going to take away from what we offer to kids, we are going to take a position to try to push back and to fight. And so every single thing, I think we've become so accustomed, and I just think this is sort of natural for most organizations. The regulators are coming, the various folks, the feds, the state, city, and they just want one little thing, and it's just easier to kind of scribble it out or type it out and write it the way that they want and just send it over. And before too long, as Kevin describes, it becomes a monolithic bureaucracy. And so we resist every single point. Not resist, but we look very carefully and we ask, and we enter into a regular conversation with our authorizer and our regulators, and to understand, do you actually have the time to look at this? Do you have the staff? And what is it that you actually want to achieve? Because maybe we can shortcut that for you and just give you the information and the documents that you need. And for the most part, those that are interested in focusing on children and outcomes, they're willing to have that conversation because they're not funded sufficiently to go through thousands and thousands of pieces of paper. But it's a real danger because when people are afraid, when people talk about accountability for charter schools, the answer, the easy answer, especially when it comes to politics and the noise that charter schools often face, the easy answer is to sort of slap additional paper on there and say, oh, we're actually checking for that. See, we asked for that information and we've got it now. And it's very hard to disabuse people of that notion that the additional paper is helpful. I want to give one example of a piece of paper that we really, truly dislike. And it's every year there's this requirement that teachers who are not certified have to send home in the backpack folder for their scholars a piece of paper saying, just wanted you to know, parents, I'm not highly qualified. So yes, I've been teaching for 5 years, and my scholars are in the top 1% in the state of New York, but I just wanted you to know that I didn't have that thing called highly qualified, and somebody thought that I should write you and tell you and let you know. I mean, it's to a level that is truly, truly absurd, whereas we would want the teacher to write home and say, look, this is what we're doing to get your scholar to the highest potential, and I've been doing it for 5 years very successfully, and this is what you need to do is bring your child to school on time, pick your child up from school on time, get the homework done, and make sure that they are motivated at school. And that's what we'd like to do, and we have to do the other thing instead.
You know, I wanted to respond to the question, what can private schools do? I think that this is the essence of educational choice. I mean, at the end of the day, if you run an elementary school and the light of learning is still in the eyes of those particularly black and brown boys in 4th and 5th grade, then you know what, you're running a good school. Because unfortunately, we've got, you know, nearly 2,000 dropout factories, and those are schools where we know 90% of the kids are going to drop out of school. And the light of learning is out of the eyes of those kids in 4th and 5th grade. And if parents want to go there because they know that that nurturing and learning is taking place, and you're demonstrating that you can teach these babies in a way that will meet them where they are and accommodate their needs and not force a circle and a square, then you're doing great work. And, you know, going back to this bureaucracy thing, you know, I remember several years ago when I was in office here in D.C., and you're right, Eva and I used to talk a lot because Eva Moskowitz, who runs Harlem Success, was chair of the New York Public School, New York City Council Education Committee at the same time as D.C., and we were both getting beat up, pickets around the house and everything, so we used to talk all the time. But, you know, at the end of the day, D.C. had 146 schools, D.C. public schools. They had nearly 2,000 people in central office. The Archdiocese of D.C. had 110 schools, and they had about 10 people in central office. So, and their outputs were better. So at the end of the day, we know that you don't need a large central office to run good schools. And I think that parents know that. So why not find ways to continue to give parents those opportunities as opposed to telling parents, you have to do it this way because the system works this way. The focus on the way the system is used to operating, that's an anachronism. That's old. That's gone. I mean, right now, with this new way of living, if you are a 5-year-old today, chances are you will work in a job that doesn't exist today. So we've got this whole approach to school and learning to try to develop kids for careers that ain't even going to exist. And so now we've got systems in place to run school districts that are going to be outdated over the next 10 to 15 years. And so I think that part of what we need to do is step back and say, we've got all these different kids. No one, Rod Page talked about choice. No one responds to the same learning modalities. So why don't we figure out, just like that menu in a restaurant or the buffet line, because I tell people all the time, if it's just chicken fried steak, I ain't eating. Because I just don't like chicken fried steak. But you have all these menu options for parents, and what the school district does is tell you, no, you can only have it this way, and this is the only way you're going to get it, and this is the only way. You're going to take algebra in the 9th grade, even if you ain't ready for it, or even if you should have taken it a couple years before that, because your grandmama took it in the 9th grade. So, that's the way we do it. That's the way we don't change it. If you try to change it, there's something wrong with you. So, no, I think that private schools can continue to do what they do and feature that because parents are demanding something other than what they've been getting from far too many schools.
So, Ann, so if you want to build on that, that's fine. But also, I'm curious, you have done a lot of this work on the ground level in Louisiana. curious, given all of these challenges and questions, how do you bring people together? How do you kind of build that coalition where folks who maybe have different concerns can find enough common ground to go ahead and pass choice legislation and make this happen for kids?
Yeah, and that, in the early years of us in Louisiana, introducing choice and vouchers and expanding charter schools, again, we had to fight with the tradition of public school. It was very hard and difficult at the time to convince my colleagues, especially my colleagues in the caucus, in the Black caucus, that it didn't matter that it was perceived that this whole movement was a movement of white Republicans. But the thing I used to tell my colleagues was that doesn't matter. At the end of the day, who's benefiting? Our kids. And so I don't care who's writing the check. All I care is who is benefiting from that check. And so at the end of the day, we had to begin to show, and I can honestly say today we are getting many more of our colleagues and in Louisiana to understand that you're right. This is not about who's writing the check, but it is about who is benefiting. I really would like to say one other thing about to the person who raised the question about what can private schools do. What you can do is continue to do what you do, and that means continue to demand excellence. Continue within your own organizations. Continue to be unique, because that's the beauty of choice. The beauty of choice that we've found, and what I hear from parents, even if their kid is in a performing school, is that I need a school that meets my child where he or she is. I had 3 beautiful daughters, still do not have. I have 3 beautiful daughters, and I have 3 gorgeous granddaughters. And if I could have had them first, it would have been wonderful. But each one, honestly, each one of my girls and each one of my granddaughters, and 2 are twins, have totally different personalities. And, we hear this and we know this. Every single one of them learned differently and are learning differently. And the ability for my girls to choose or to find a school that not only met the academic needs, but also met the personal and the nurturing needs. So what you have is a unique opportunity to create that brand, to create that family of learners that is unique and is important and will be important to somebody's child. So continue to do what you do, continue to build excellence. Speaking from, and build your brand, speaking from the perspective of higher ed, as mentioned, I'm the chairwoman of LSU's Board of Supervisors. And when we look at the kids that are applying to LSU, and when we look at, and we ask in some of the questions, what school did you attend? Certain schools just stand out, and so when we hear the X, and I don't want to mention schools, but when we hear of certain schools that a child is coming from, we know that child, just because of the brand, just because of the excellence that school has maintained within their own organization, and try and be another school, they were their school. When we hear those kids, we want them. And we go after them. And so that's what I could suggest to the private schools who have that opportunity to create your own brand and to continue the excellence in your own unique fashion.
Emily, I think we have time for one more question. I'm kind of curious. Kevin mentioned earlier that Randy Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, and he have sparred sometimes over school choice questions. And we know that the unions are often portray themselves as concerned about school choice. I'm curious about why. I mean, it seems to me that so much of what school choice does for students, it also does for teachers. It gives them a chance to find schools where they want to work. It gives them a chance to maybe get away from some of the paper shuffling and bureaucracy and try to find schools where they can spend more time teaching kids. Can you help me understand a little bit why it is that either teachers or their associations might push back on choice and what's going on there?
Well, Rick, you've stuck me with a challenging question, and if I may, you know, look, teachers' unions are not, and we are for, we think there's room for everybody, but I don't think that that view is shared on the other side. And I think the reason for that is because they are very interested in protecting sort of the lowest common denominator. So rather than in New York State, for example, or probably across the United States, it's extremely, extremely challenging to take a teacher who is, as you know, who is not performing and to remove them from the classroom. And for some reason, we believe that demanding extraordinary performance and quality from teachers, that elevates the teaching profession. It's respecting teachers as the professionals that they are. For some reason, that's extremely threatening to the teachers' union that we demand excellence, and then we think that if you're not executing for children, that you should not be in this profession. So they're very interested in protecting the lowest common denominator, which we just won't do, just as we wouldn't for our scholars. We teach to the highest common denominator, and same way we expect for our teachers to meet a very, very high bar.
But Kevin, I mean, am I wrong?
Yeah.
The school choice can empower educators just
Well,
like it empowers
it can. And Emily's point, lowest form common denominator. I mean, traditional unions have fought against the firing of teachers who molest kids. That's the lowest form of common denominator, let's say. Look, at the end of the day, the only people who are fighting against educational choice, the only people that fight it are the ones that already have it. Okay? If you have educational choice, you have the luxury to say, well, I can send my kid, I got the money, I got the resources, I got the neighborhood, I got the zip code, I can send my kid over here, but I don't want you to. I mean, there's something frankly not right about that. And we need to distinguish between the political arm of the organized teachers union and teachers. When we had that rally a couple weeks ago, 3,000 parents and teachers and students, we had a bunch of teachers who remember the Alabama Teachers Union who marched right across the street from the union headquarters and said, I want to be able to put my kid in a quality private school if I have that opportunity. So I think we have to distinguish the politics of education, which is held, you know, out there in front by the union forces, the bureaucracy, the status quo, and then those folks who are fighting against that to try to get something better for their kids. And that's not the teachers. I think school choice, as Dr. Page said, when they did that study, would increase teachers' salaries by up to $12,000 to $15,000 a year. And I've heard so many people who run charter schools. I know there are folks at Richard Wright who taught in the traditional system. So many charter school teachers and principals said that for the first time they could do their job because they had the freedom from the bureaucracy to do their job when they got, you know I'm right, this brother here who helps run the school. Rick's trying to stop me, but I ain't stopping, just so we're clear. So, no, I do think that we have to distinguish the politics of education held sway by the union as opposed to the teachers, rank and file teachers.
I think that is a strong place to close and a great transition to the next panel. Please join me in thanking